You learned how to use JavaScript to call a simple web method without a return value in the previous lesson. In order to call a web method that returns a value, you need to use a slightly different technique. In this lesson, you will use JavaScript code to call the getMessages web method from the C# code behind file of default.aspx. You will then display its return value on the page. To begin, open the MegaChat project from your sample files folder. And open default.aspx in Source View. Now find the getMessages function in the code. This function does not yet contain any code. You're going to add code to this function to call the getMessages web method. Examine the connectUser function now. At the bottom of this function, you can see the code messagetimer equals setInterval getMessages 1000. This JavaScript code creates a JavaScript timer that calls the getMessages function every second. That's 1000 milliseconds. Now add the following code to the getMessages function. Page methods .getMessages begin brackets function begin brackets response end brackets begin curly brackets end curly brackets end brackets semicolon. After using C#, you may initially find this syntax confusing. The code is very similar to the code that you created in Lesson 9.7. It appears as though you have added an argument when calling the getMessages web method. The function that you added isn't actually an argument. It is in fact a JavaScript function that will run when the getMessages web method finishes and returns a value. Without this function, your JavaScript code would have no way of knowing when the getMessages web method was finished. When a web method has both arguments and a return value, you need to specify the arguments before the function. You can see this being done in the connectUser JavaScript function. The response argument of your function will retrieve the value that was returned by the getMessages web method. Add the following code inside the nested function to display the returned value. DisplayMessage response. The DisplayMessage function displays the value that was returned from the getMessages web method inside the chatbox div tag. Test your code now by viewing default.aspx in your web browser. When the page loads, enter a username. Now copy the URL from your web browser's address bar, open a new web browser window, and navigate to the same address, then enter another username, and finally position the windows side by side on your screen and chat between them. The messages are displayed by your JavaScript code without refreshing the page. Close your web browser windows now and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 9.8. Call a web method that returns a value using JavaScript.